The oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook is also the simplest. When the walls are closing in, when the scandals are multiplying, when the investigations are converging, create chaos so overwhelming that nobody can focus on any single thread long enough to pull it all the way through. The government shutdown that has paralyzed federal operations, that has sent hundreds of thousands of workers home without pay, that has created genuine hardship for millions of Americans who depend on government services, is being presented by the administration as a principled stand over policy priorities. But a closer examination of the timing, of what else is happening simultaneously, of what stories are being buried beneath the avalanche of shutdown coverage, reveals something else entirely. This is not a policy dispute that accidentally escalated into institutional crisis. This is a deliberately engineered distraction, a smokescreen deployed at precisely the moment when multiple lines of accountability were converging on the president and his inner circle. And the evidence that this is exactly what is happening is hiding in plain sight, visible to anyone willing to look at what the shutdown is preventing us from seeing. The immediate catalyst for the shutdown, according to the administration's public narrative, involves a dispute over funding priorities, over the allocation of resources, over competing visions of what the federal government should be doing and how much it should spend doing it. These are real policy disagreements, the kind that happen in every budget cycle, the kind that democratic institutions are designed to resolve through negotiation and compromise. But the timing of this particular shutdown, the specific moment when the administration chose to make these disagreements into a crisis requiring the closure of government operations, corresponds with suspicious precision to a series of other developments that the administration has every reason to want buried beneath breaking news alerts about shutdown drama. Consider what was happening in the days immediately before the shutdown began. Multiple federal courts were issuing orders requiring the administration to comply with document requests, to produce materials that investigations had been seeking for months to stop obstructing legitimate oversight. The Epstein files had reached a critical juncture, with congressional committees preparing public hearings featuring testimony that promised to be explosive. The pattern of administration defiance of court orders had reached a point where judges, including Republican-appointed judges, were erupting in open court with language that made clear their belief that constitutional crisis was no longer theoretical, but actual. The economic data that the administration had been spinning as evidence of prosperity was being revised downward in ways that made the gap between official claims and economic reality increasingly difficult to ignore. The departure of thousands of lawyers from the Department of Justice was creating a visible record of institutional collapse that no amount of spin could fully obscure. Each of these stories, pursued individually with the sustained attention they deserved, represented a serious threat to the administration's political survival and potentially to the personal freedom of individuals within the president's inner circle. And then, suddenly, the government shut down. And the news cycle, which had been gradually building momentum on each of these threads, pivoted entirely to shutdown coverage. The court orders became secondary stories, covered briefly, if at all, certainly not with the sustained investigative focus that might have revealed their full significance. The Epstein hearings were postponed, with the excuse that the shutdown made it impossible to convene them, though careful observers noted that congressional hearings have continued during previous shutdowns when there was political will to hold them. The economic data releases were delayed, with official explanations about furloughed statisticians, though the timing meant that revised figures showing economic weakness would not become public until well after the political moment when they might have mattered most. The DOJ exodus continued but was covered, if at all, as a footnote to shutdown stories rather than as the institutional crisis it actually represented. The pattern is not new. Throughout his political career, Trump has demonstrated an instinctive understanding that controlling attention is more important than controlling facts, that if you can determine what people are talking about, you can prevent them from talking about things that are more dangerous to your interests. The strategy has been deployed repeatedly, sometimes clumsily, and sometimes with sophisticated precision, but always with the same underlying logic. Create a crisis that dominates coverage, that forces every news organization to focus on the immediate drama that pushes more complex and more damaging stories off the front page and out of the public consciousness. The shutdown is the most extreme version of this strategy yet deployed, because shutting down the government has real consequences, creates genuine hardship, and damages institutions in ways that may take years to repair. But from the perspective of a president facing multiple existential threats, those costs are acceptable if the alternative is sustained public attention on stories that could end the presidency or lead to criminal accountability. The mechanics of how this works are worth understanding in detail. Modern news coverage operates on an attention economy, where editorial decisions about what to cover are driven by audience engagement, by ratings, by clicks, by shares, by all the metrics that determine commercial success in a competitive media environment. A government shutdown is exactly the kind of story that drives engagement. It has immediate impact on millions of people. It creates ongoing drama as negotiations proceed or fail to proceed. It generates partisan controversy that audiences find compelling. It produces the kind of breaking news developments, the surprise announcements, the dramatic press conferences that keep people checking their phones and refreshing their browsers. For news organizations operating in this environment, the pressure to prioritize shutdown coverage is enormous, not because editors are being manipulated, but because their business model depends on covering the stories that audiences are most engaged with. The administration understands this dynamic and exploits it ruthlessly. By creating a crisis that generates the kind of coverage that pushes other stories aside, by ensuring that the shutdown remains the dominant story through strategic leaks and dramatic pronouncements and calculated provocations, by keeping the attention focused on the immediate crisis rather than on the deeper patterns of corruption and constitutional violation, the administration achieves exactly what it needs: time. Time for court deadlines to pass. Time for public attention to move on. Time for the accumulated evidence of wrongdoing to become old news, yesterday's story, something that audiences have already processed and moved beyond, even if they never actually saw the full picture, because their attention was elsewhere when it mattered most. The constitutional implications of using government shutdown as a political weapon are profound and deeply troubling. The power of the purse belongs to Congress, not to the president. The executive branch is required to implement laws as passed, to execute the functions of government as authorized by the legislative branch, to operate within the budget constraints that Congress establishes. When a president deliberately engineers a shutdown as a means of political manipulation, as a tool for escaping accountability, as a smokescreen for concealing evidence of wrongdoing, that represents a fundamental perversion of constitutional structure. The shutdown power, such as it exists, was never intended to be used this way. It was understood as a failure of governance, something that happened when political actors could not reach agreement, not as a strategic tool that could be deployed deliberately to serve political purposes unrelated to the budget disputes that supposedly justify it. The damage extends beyond the immediate impact on federal workers and the millions of Americans who depend on government services. Each time the shutdown power is weaponized in this way, it becomes more normalized, more accepted as a routine tool of political combat, rather than as an extraordinary failure requiring immediate resolution. Future presidents, watching how effectively Trump has used the shutdown as a smokescreen, will be tempted to deploy the same tactic. Future Congresses, having seen their oversight powers frustrated by the simple expedient of shutting down the government at moments when oversight was becoming dangerous, will find their constitutional authority further eroded. The precedent being set is that accountability can be escaped through chaos, that evidence can be concealed through distraction, and that the institutional mechanisms designed to check executive power can be neutralized by a president willing to impose sufficient costs on the public to force attention away from his own wrongdoing. The stories being buried beneath the shutdown deserve sustained attention and investigative focus. The Epstein files represent one of the most significant accountability moments in modern American political history, with implications that extend into the highest levels of political and financial power. The pattern of court-order defiance represents a direct assault on the rule of law and on the independence of the judiciary. The economic data that is being delayed and obscured reveals an economy that is far weaker than official rhetoric suggests, with consequences for millions of working families whose economic security depends on having accurate information about the true state of economic conditions. The exodus from the Department of Justice represents the hollowing out of a critical institution, the loss of expertise and integrity that will have consequences for the administration of justice for years to come. Each of these stories, fully told, would dominate news cycles for weeks. Each represents a genuine crisis requiring public attention and institutional response, and each is being successfully obscured by a shutdown that, however real its immediate impacts, serves primarily as a distraction from accountability. The question of what happens next, of whether this strategy will succeed, depends entirely on whether journalists, investigators, and the public itself can maintain focus on multiple threats simultaneously. The challenge is real. The human capacity for sustained attention is limited. The news cycle is designed to move quickly from story to story. The structural pressures that make shutdown coverage dominant are not going away. But the alternative to meeting this challenge is accepting that accountability can be escaped through distraction, that evidence can be concealed through chaos, and that democratic oversight can be frustrated by a president willing to shut down the government whenever investigations get too close to revealing the truth. The shutdown will eventually end. The government will resume operations. Federal workers will return to their jobs. The immediate crisis will resolve. But the questions that the shutdown was designed to prevent us from asking will remain. What is in the documents that courts have ordered produced? What testimony would have been given at the Epstein hearings that were postponed? What do the economic data revisions that were delayed actually show? Why are thousands of lawyers abandoning the Department of Justice? These questions have answers. The answers exist in documents and testimony and data that remain accessible if anyone is willing to look for them. But looking requires breaking through the smokescreen, requires recognizing the shutdown for what it actually is, and requires refusing to allow distraction to substitute for accountability. Whether that happens depends not on the administration, which has already made clear its strategy, but on everyone else. On journalists who must cover the shutdown without losing sight of what it is concealing. On investigators who must continue pursuing evidence even when public attention is elsewhere. On a public that must demand answers to questions that the chaos is designed to make them forget to ask. The smokescreen is real, but it only works if we let it.